And cities that were less able to protect themselves were not going to be able to protect themselves. So where one city was putting up a levee, Stanford did a study that showed that the water would have to go into some other community. And that was of great concern. So the law SB 272 was passed, and that requires a regional approach to sea level rise. And it's going to require every single local government that has a bay or a coast edge, as San Mateo does, to come up with a plan. And that the plan has to be approved by BCDC or by the Coastal Commission. And this, we have 10 years to do this. However, the sooner a city does it, the sooner they can apply for grants. You'll have to pardon my dog's barking in the background. So the BCDC has been entrusted with developing the guidelines. And that's because they are an entity that goes all around the bay. The plan is called the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan, already been given an acronym, the RSAP. In that, they are dividing the bay into sub-regional areas, sort of not exactly county areas, but each of those areas will have its own set of guidelines and its own maps and its strategies that are appropriate sea level rise, for nature-based adaptation. And all of you may remember that Bay Adapt has been going on for the last 3 years. And a lot of cities have actually adopted the Bay Adapt goals. And two of the goals are to put nature first whenever possible, and also to support communities that are least able to protect themselves. So I wanted to talk about the fact that the bay has certain ecosystems. Nature, putting nature first, means actually a recognition that nature's ecosystems are quite useful. And it provides a lot of ecological services that we don't always recognize. And I'd just like to touch on them. So marshes provide flood control. They protect the edge of our shoreline. They absorb storm water as it comes out through our storm system, and they hold it before letting it into the bay. The marshes prevent the waves, the action from eroding the shores. And the really interesting thing about them is that as they trap sediment and dirt, they grow higher, and therefore they tend to keep up with sea levels rising. And that's a really important aspect of marsh growth. Another aspect is that the bay actually has an enormous role to play in cleaning the water. We all know that the storm water that goes into the creeks carries with it a lot of pollutants, a lot of tire dust, brake dust, fertilizers from our yards. And all of this empties into the creek, and then the creeks empty into the bay and into the wetlands. However, the marshes are what work their magic in taking out all the pollutants, not all, but they take out a lot of the pollutants. They trap the sediment, they trap the dirt, and they grow taller. The plants actually are very effective in removing pesticides and even remove heavy metals. They also have a great role. The living shorelines have a big role in cleaning the air. Because when you think about it, marshes have very fast growing plants. They absorb CO2, and then they keep the carbon and they release the oxygen. Now, we've learned about this when we were kids in grade school and elementary school. But if you look at eelgrass meadows, which are underwater plants, they're actually a grass that has adapted to growing underneath the water where you can get sunshine. They take in the CO2 and you can see them releasing the oxygen. It sort of bubbles out when the sun shines. It's really, really rather amazing to watch. And you can see it on YouTube. They have videos on that. We talk about carbon sequestration. The marshes and wetlands can sequester more carbon than tropical rainforests. And that's an amazing aspect because the marshes grow extremely fast. They they also, when they die, they sink to the bottom and it's anaerobic down there. So they don't actually deteriorate. They they keep that carbon and keep it for hundreds of years in some cases. So carbon sequestration and what they call blue carbon is very important aspect of the marshes around our bay. And of course, the creatures in the bay. We have a lot of creatures in our bay. And since 1960s, when we stopped filling in the bay and started cleaning it up, the creatures have started coming back. I know people who will say, we never used to see pelicans in the bay, and now you have a lot of pelicans in the bay. Uh, these are all, some of them are endangered species, some of them are species of special concern, but there is a lot of wildlife that's dependent on a living shoreline. So here's the thing to remember. It's the wetlands and the shallow water habitats that are the living part of the bay. It's not the deep water. The deep waters are like deserts, but the shallow waters are all the life. And without them, we wouldn't have the eco-services that we count on. So sea level rise solutions. So the first thing one thinks about is levees and seawalls and armoring it. And they are expensive. They are expensive projects and they can have expensive problems. As you can see, here, this is a levee that's liquefied during an earthquake, and all of our bay edges are on fill, so they're susceptible to liquefaction. Levees broke. This is the Pajaro levee that broke in 2 years ago. Last year? Was it last year? The structures can break like they did in New Orleans. And we have a lot of creatures that are always making holes in the levee. We have a lot of what are they called? Not moles, but gophers that are ground squirrels that make holes in our levees. So what are the nature-based alternatives? The basic idea is the idea of nature-based adaptation is not that you come up with a different solution than a levee. It's that you come up with something that has multiple benefits, and it uses the biodiversity and the services to then reduce your vulnerability to sea level rise. So you go from all the way from fully natural to some hybrid versions. But let's look at some of the natural ones that we have. A good place, by the way, to start. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Adaptation Atlas. It was done by the San Francisco Estuary Institute and SPUR a few years ago. And it went all around the bay. It went all around the bay and looked at the edge all around the bay and divided the whole bay into 30 operation landscape units, OLUs. That's sort of become a term that's used now in OLU. And the OLU shares certain features, like if you look at San Francisco, number 30, its characteristic is that the water is very deep, it's very steep, there are no beaches, mostly. A lot of them have no beaches. And so if you think of the South Bay, it's very shallow. So there are different sets of nature-based measures that would apply in the South Bay than would apply in San Francisco. And the adaptation atlas is useful because it describes the nature-based strategies really well. So it's a really go-to things, become a kind of Bible for agencies. So let's look at some of them. The tidal wetlands. These include mudflats, marshes, and upland areas. And they are areas where there is some water action during the season. Now, these are all right where the tides go up and down, and they are at risk of drowning, obviously, as sea levels rise. So we have a problem with our marshes. This is a map that shows what the marshes were like, 150 years ago. All the green areas are marshes, and the little brown things are mudflats, which is where it's covered more with water more of the time, so the grasses don't grow. And then the marshes are where the water comes part of the time. So this is what it looks like now, where the green areas are tidal marshes, and the brown edges are the mudflats. So there's very little of it left. Let me go back to that for a minute. There has been a good amount of work there. In 2010, the joint San Francisco Bay Joint Partnership estimated 100,000 acres of tidal wetlands were required in order to get it back to a healthy bay. And we are at about 65 right now. But since then, we've learned about sea level rise, and they have actually revised their estimates now to be 125,000 acres of wetlands, plus migration space and transition zones and migration space, because as tidal wetlands drown, they need to slowly, each year move up an inch or two to move uphill. So that's we need space for migration of wetlands as well as wetlands. I'm trying to move this black bar away. Okay. We need clean sewer water. We saw that storm water goes into the marshes and gets cleaned. But since 1972, when the Clean Water Act was passed, only treated sewage has been allowed to go into the bay. Before that, we just dumped sewage. So in 72, they set up standards. However, those plants are all aging now, and they pretty much reached the end of their lives. And we're facing another problem as the population has grown and the amount of treated sewage has been growing. This treated sewage actually still has a lot of nitrogen in it and some other pollutants, which were allowed. But in the last couple of years, I don't know if you remember that previous year, we had a huge die-off of fish. And this is one of the images from near Oakland. They actually tested the water at several depths, and there was zero oxygen, no oxygen, because the algae was absorbing all the oxygen in the water and leaving none of it for the fish. So we had huge die-off and huge growth of algae. Last year was not that bad, but it was not as bad as the previous year, but it was bad. So therefore, we have a new law. The Water Quality Control Board is in, I think, June 20th. The new law will pass for, I don't know, law, ordinance, whatever we call it, that all around the bay, the 37 wastewater treatment plants will have to reduce their fertilizer and their sewage in their water by 40%. That is a lot, and that is critical. So how would they do it? And this is actually what they are experimenting with, and which is working really well. It's worked well in Florida. It's worked well in Chesapeake Bay. And this is what we probably will need to do. So this is a new kind of, it's sort of a levee cum clean water, polishing the water. So as you can see, to the upper right is a levee with no marsh in front of it. And so it's shown, I don't know if you can read that, as 13.5 feet because the wave action would go over it. If you put a marsh in front of it, it drops down to half the size, 7 foot. So immediately the cost of the levee goes way down, plus the space a levee would take. And the large picture shows you how a very gentle slope with the water along the top, like that curved white line. Imagine that to be a perforated pipe with treated sewage water. They release it into the root of the plants here. It runs down the hill, and by the time it reaches the bay, it's 99% cleaned. It's almost like drinking water at that point. So this is what they need to do. And here's, for example, Redwood Shores. This is the treatment plant. You can see that if we will need to be putting a levee around it anyway, right? You can see where an ecotone levee, as they call it, would be perfect in a situation like this. So that is another way to get clean water using nature-based adaptation. Now, I remember mentioning eelgrass meadows. Eelgrass meadows are a really important, how shall I say, arrow in the quiver of the arsenal of different nature-based adaptations, because eelgrass meadows break up wave action, and the waves get very much reduced as they get to the shore. They are also extremely rich from a biodiversity point of view. So the eelgrass meadows here, this is the airport, and this is the edge of Millbrae Burlingame edge. There are eelgrass meadows here. They're very valuable eelgrass meadows. These need to be enhanced. We need to make sure that whatever we do in this area improves the eelgrass meadows and doesn't kill them. Yet another important element is oyster reefs. As you know, all reefs, coral reefs around an island, they break up the waves. If you want to get to the waves, you have to get outside the coral reef. Well, oyster reefs used to be very much they used to have a lot of oysters in the bay, right? We all know that from just Jack London's stories of the oyster pirates and so forth. So oyster reefs outside of eelgrass meadows are a perfect combination. So here you see actually an experiment in San Rafael where they created a reef and they planted eelgrass. And that actually worked pretty well. And I want to just do a shout out for oysters. Oysters are great to eat, but can you imagine drinking 50 gallons of water a day? That's what every single oyster does. And it cleans the water and clarifies the water. Another item are beaches, not the kind of beaches, with umbrellas and people on them, but the kind of beach you're seeing here, which is one that breaks up waves, and the waves don't actually destroy the shore. And this was an island, Aramburu Island in Marin. You can see the boats over here. People have boats and docks and so forth. And they were wondering about developing more onto this island when they realized that actually it's protecting their shores tremendously. So they actually used it as an erosion, to prevent erosion of their shore.
Gita, you have about 5 minutes left, okay?
All right, good. So the sea level rise and pollution risk is very serious for communities. And there are communities around the bay where there are a lot of very toxics, and they are hopefully organizing and trying to come around, or trying to get agencies, all the agencies, to look at what they can do to remediate those, because as groundwater is rising, it's pushing these contaminants out of the bay. So, oops, wrong way. So something that occurs to me is, what if we were to change our thinking? What if we were to think instead of how can we keep the water out? How about if we think about being able to eat the food from the bay? If we really wanted to do that, a lot of these nature-based solutions would just fall in place automatically. And I was just thinking, South San Francisco has an oyster point. It needs an oyster festival every year. Finally, I want to touch on funding and FEMA. The agencies, along with with this new law that was passed, they have been retooling for the fact that we need to be able to include nature-based solutions in our sea level rise plans. And FEMA is notoriously difficult to work with. I have sat in on seminars at the highest levels of FEMA where they talk about using nature-based adaptations. But as you filter down, it's trickled down to the persons in the field. They don't always yet have the tools for including nature-based adaptations into their calculations when they say that you've been able to do enough. So FEMA funding agencies, all of them are slowly moving around to this. And within the next few years, we will see them all recognizing nature-based adaptation for the values that it gives, because the costs are very real. We would lose flood mitigation if the marshes drowned. We would lose clean water if we didn't treat, if we didn't use nature to clean the storm water and now the sewer water also. We would lose our fresh, cool bay air without all the oxygen that it provides, the carbon capture, and not to speak of the habitat. The biodiversity in the Bay Area would absolutely collapse if we didn't have marshes and wetlands and living shorelines. So we really need, for our own sake, to keep this bay alive and to make it healthier. We've done good work on it. We need to keep doing good work. We need to not now panic and just throw up levees and armor our shorelines and seawalls. We need to use the power of nature because nature is extremely powerful. So I think Karen said that we have some time for questions.
I think maybe one question, Gita, because we have
Okay.
a very full agenda. So who?
Perfect. Anyone? I'll see if I can answer it. Ashley, you're muted.
Oh, okay. I'll unmute her.
I think Ashley's still muted.
There.
There we go.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to thank you, Gita, for a very enlightening and easy to understand presentation. My question is, we know we're in a climate crisis. We know how severe the problems are. How dire is our situation? Do we reach a point of no return where we will not be no longer able to make the changes to save the bay?
Good. It's a good point. There was a very interesting study put out 2 years ago about sediment, because there's so much value in saving the marshes, and the marshes need to keep up with sea level rise. There is some fear that if the sea levels start rising really fast, maybe the marshes won't be able to keep up. So they are actually looking at some of the rules about sediment. For example, the Corps of Engineers currently dredges all the ship channels, but it takes all the dredge material out to the Farallon Islands and dumps it over the cliff there. So they're now working to say, okay, we need to save the sediment and use it in our marshes so that our marshes can grow. That's just an example of one thing. They're also talking about making sure that the creeks, when they come out, that they allow the sediment to come out with the creeks rather than trying to trap it and take it away, so that the marshes around it and the edges will keep growing. Does that, I mean, I know I have a lot of other things I could add, but that's a start.
It's a big subject. Thank you.
And Helen,
Ellen, you've got the last question.
Hi.
hi.
So Gita, nice to see you. I appreciate what you're doing, and I definitely absolutely support living levies and such. We have, I'm now working for the city of Half Moon Bay on the coast, not the bay side. And I will tell you right now, when you're saying under SB 272 that we are supposed to pay for these things, and this is what's happening in San Mateo County, a lot of people are, sheriff costs went up by 43%. TOT for City of Half Moon Bay went down dramatically. We're facing a $5 million budget deficit. And that's, our reserves are 8 million. So there's actually, to expect these local municipalities is going to be really challenging. I'm just telling you what's going on so that you understand the economics of it. And I gotta tell you, to make it more dire, to really be a black cloud on everyone's evening before we get to Israel and Gaza. I have to tell you also that, the people in Kansas at the federal, they don't want to bail people out on the California coast with federal dollars, and Central Valley folks don't want to bail people out on the coast either, or on the Bay. So it's going to be really, really hard to pay for this. So
Well, I just want to mention that SB 272 comes with funding, so that it does say that the cities will be funded for the studies for doing their plans. And
right.
that is an important part, because they didn't want to put it with no funding, because then no one has the money to do it.
Yeah.
But yes, they are trying very hard to make sure that there is grant funding. In fact, Ocean Protection Council announced a new grant program just last month. And they said that for planning, anyone who applies will qualify, will get the money. It's not competitive. You just need to apply for it. So they are really trying to bend over
It's
backwards,
just
make sure there's
absolutely, I mean, I used to be in your role, so now that I'm on the other side, to pay for this is astronomically expensive,
Okay.
So I just want people to understand what we're facing, because people want to do it, but for instance, we've been trying on the base side, along the Dumbarton Bridge. There's a PG&E substation right there, right at the Dumbarton Bridge. And that's probably about I think $100 million project into Redwood City, because if that substation gets inundated, you're talking about 350,000 people without power.
So I think we should stop here, okay? Because we have a really long agenda, okay? If that's okay with you.
I want to thank you all for listening, and it's very, as Helen said, it's very close to my heart, very important, and I think a lot of lawmakers are trying their best to put money behind the plans, and I think that's very laudable that they are trying to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for talking to us, Gita. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.